Shalom. This week we will conclude the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, with a reading of a double portion, that is, two Torah portions, the last two Torah portions of the book, Parashat Matot and Masei, beginning in chapter 30 and verse 2. The first portion, Parashat Matot, opens with the concept of vows and oaths, which emphasizes the power and seriousness of words, of speech. Words can affect change. They can change someone's or something's status and make it sanctified. Vows and oaths, this subject kind of makes you want to stop and think about the promises that are made and not kept, which is something that leaders, or should I say politicians, because they're not really leaders, do at times, all the time, especially when seeking re-election. But on the subject of words, think for a moment, look back at the book of Bamidbar and reflect on how much of it has been taken up with or influenced by words and the results. The sin of the spies, the rebellion of Korach, the complaining about the manna, the evil speech against Moses, the confession of the Sota, the Nazarite vow, the priestly blessing, the question brought forward about the second Passover. Moshe was supposed to speak to the rock, but hid it instead. The fiery serpents that were set upon Israel were brought about by complaining. The song that was sung by Israel at the water. The power of the words of Balaam. Look how much we have been occupied with and influenced by and changed by words. Further, in Parashat Matot, we learn of God's command to Moses that Israel do battle with the Midianites to take revenge for their plot to cause the children of Israel to worship idolatry by seducing the men of Israel with their own daughters. And God calls this battle a battle of vengeance, telling Moses, take vengeance for the children of Israel against the Midianites. But Moses informs the people that they are to inflict God's vengeance. So God's instructions to right the wrong done to his children becomes righting the wrong that was done to him. Interesting. God is clearly stating, when you hurt my children, you're hurting me. So let's keep that in mind. We also learn of the request of the tribes of Reuven and Gad to remain on the other side of the Jordan, where the grazing was very lush, in order to accommodate the great herds with which they were blessed. And we learn of Moses' objection. He gave them a condition that they go into battle together and on behalf of the rest of their brethren, and they accepted the conditions. But the harshness of Moshe's reaction, comparing them as he did to the request of comparing their request as he did to the sin of the spies, informs us of the severity with which their simple request was viewed. Or simply put, their priorities were totally misplaced. Their perspective was based on materialism rather than spiritual well-being and concern for the spiritual well-being of their own children, especially to ensure the future generations. So yesterday, a plane arrived here in Israel carrying 220 Jews from North America, including 95 children, who are making aliyah, meaning they have immigrated to Israel to make new lives for themselves here as Jews in the Jewish state. And their departure from New York's Kennedy Airport and their arrival at Ben Gurion in Tel Aviv and the reception that was held for these families was filmed. You can see it online. It's extremely moving and heartwarming to see the dedication and really the courage of these families who have given up their lives, the past, everything that they've known, to make a new life here in the land of Israel. And the only reason that they did it, and the only reason that we all did it, is because we know that this is where our people belong, and this is the land that God gave to us. And he never gave it to anyone else. And I couldn't help thinking, watching this moving footage, of what a tikkun, what a spiritual rectification it is to see Jews coming home to Israel, the very week in which we read of these two tribes who sought to stay outside the land of Israel, and the very week in which we continue with the second portion of our double portion, Parashat Matot-Masei, in which we read the summary of all the journeys of the children of Israel through the desert and the howling wilderness until finally they are ready to enter into the land. And one of the most profound and timeless teachings concerning the repetition of these journeys in this parasha and the naming of each departure point and destination is that we all have to go through everything that we have to go through in the most amazingly, divinely choreographed movements in order to get to where we need to be and become the people that we were meant to be. And nothing can stand in the way of these journeys that we must take that shape us and help us to clarify just who we are and where we are going in order to get home. Always on our way home. So something is happening here and connecting these ideas, a certain theme, and that is a certain cultivated, desired sensitivity that is required of ourselves to sanctify our lives for God's purpose, and especially to sanctify our lives to live in this land, to appreciate what we have, what God has given us. But that means to appreciate everything, to appreciate our lives, each other, our homes, because everything really is sacred. And when we come into this land, there's a message that's being broadcast here. Don't take anything for granted. We started off with words. Don't take them lightly. Say what you mean and mean what you say, and stand up to your enemies is the next message we receive with the battle of the Midianites. Stand up to your enemies who are God's enemies, because an attack against Israel, God tells Moses, is an attack against me. Sensitivity to the land of Israel and how imperative it is for our survival that we be here. The logic of Reuven and God that was flawed. Sensitivity to the stages and phases and places and adventures and misadventures that befall us as we make our way home, always traveling home. And once we get there, our responsibility to the land, which is our responsibility to ourselves, to our children, and to God. In the second Torah portion, Parashat Matot-Masei, just after concluding the list of all these way stations on the journeys of the children of Israel, here's what God has to say, beginning in chapter 33 and verse 50. The Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, destroy all their temples, destroy their molten idols, and demolish their high places. You shall clear out the land and settle in it, for I have given you the land to occupy it. You shall give the land as an inheritance to your families by lots. To the large you shall give a larger inheritance, and to the small you shall give a smaller inheritance. Wherever the lot falls shall be his. According to the tribes of your fathers you shall inherit. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those whom you leave over will be as thorns in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they will harass you in the land in which you settle. And it will be that what I had intended to do to them, I will do to you." Did you hear those words in verse 53? You shall settle it. God is commanding Israel to be settlers. Does the State Department and the EU know about this? And we read, "For I have given you the land to occupy it." Does the UN know about this? Apparently, they're all correct. We are a bunch of settlers and occupiers, and God warns us what will happen if we do not drive out the inhabitants of the land. And everything that we're reading here is a preparation for going into the land, as will be the entire book of Deuteronomy. Well, what's all this preparation? The message is that we have to be completely sensitive on a different level and tune in to the new life that awaits the children of Israel in this land, to be sensitive to God's calling to us in this land. He tells Israel is to be super sensitive to human life, the most sacred thing of all. So we read that an intentional murderer deserves death. Here in verse 16 we read, "If he struck him with an iron instrument and he dies, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall be put to death. If he struck him with a fist-sized stone, which is deadly, and he dies, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall be put to death. Or with a fist-sized wooden instrument, which is deadly, and he dies, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall be put to death. The blood avenger shall kill the murderer. He may kill him when he meets him. If out of hatred he pushed him, or threw something at him with premeditation, and he died, or if he maliciously struck him with his hand and he died, the assailant shall be put to death. He is a murderer. The blood avenger may kill the murderer when he meets him. And those verses are all talking about intentional, premeditated murder. But speaking of sensitivity, ultra-sensitivity, what about the unintentional murderer? An accident. Torah here prescribes a very unique institution, the establishment of cities of refuge for unintentional murderers to flee to live out their lives under protection and free from the avenger of a loved one. We read, verse 25 begins, the congregation shall protect the murderer from the hand of the blood avenger, and the congregation shall return him to the city of refuge to which he had fled, and he shall remain there until the Kohen Gadol, the high priest who was anointed with the sacred oil, dies. But if the murderer goes beyond the border of the city of refuge to which he had fled, and the blood avenger finds him outside the limits of his city of refuge, and the blood avenger slays the murderer, he has no blood. For he shall remain in his city of refuge until the Kohen Gadol dies, and only after the Kohen Gadol has died may the murderer return to the land which is his possession. These shall be for you a statute of justice for all your generations in all your dwelling places. What an interesting idea. Why should the unintentional murderer who killed inadvertently, why should he be sentenced to exile, first of all? On a simple level, we see it's for his own protection because it's kind of like a precursor of the witness protection plan. On a deeper level, though, something did happen here, even if it was an accident. Why did it come about through him? Why did he deserve for such a terrible mishap to occur? And spiritual damage was certainly done by this death, and exile, with the deep introspection that such a life brings, will aid in fixing that. And again, this idea of the sanctity of human life and how sensitive we must be even to a total accident. But the most interesting aspect of all of this portrayal of a life of heightened awareness and sensitivity as befits the society that God instructs us to be in the land of Israel, this heightened sensitivity is exemplified by what seems to be a very singular relationship, at least on a spiritual level, between this unintentional murderer and the reigning high priest, the Kohen Gadol. We read, for he shall remain in his city of refuge until the Kohen Gadol dies, and only after the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, has died, may the murderer return to the land which is his possession. Why is the sentence of exile of the unintentional murderer connected to, why is his time measured by the life of the high priest, to the extent that when the high priest passes away, this man who murdered by accident, he may then leave the city of refuge, and no family avenger may attack him. His sentence is over, and he's safe. So the amazing prophetic holy Rashi explains in his commentary in chapter 35 and verse 25, he explains why until the Kohen Gadol dies, because, he says, the high priest should have prayed that no mishap should have befallen Israel during his lifetime. In other words, Rashi is teaching, it shouldn't have happened on his watch. He must have somehow been slack in his prayers. In other words, this man, the Kohen Gadol, who is responsible for the divine blessing reaching the world through the service of the Holy Temple, he is ultimately responsible for any slightest spiritual imbalance, however imperceptible that might be, that could even have resulted in an accidental death. He should have exercised greater spiritual prowess, greater leadership, and not even an accident would have occurred in his watch, let alone, God forbid, intentional sin of man against man. That is this leadership envisioned by Torah for the Kohanim, the high priest serving in the Holy Temple, for the society that Israel is instructed to create in the land that God gives her. A leadership so connected and so selfless that, as opposed to reacting to the people or giving them what they want or blaming them or any sort of political manipulation for selfish advancement, if someone dies somewhere by accident, it's the high priest's fault because he was not as attentive as he should have been to the spiritual needs of his people on some level. That's leadership. What a far cry from leaders of today who don't keep their word, who manipulate and advance their own agendas, who are themselves guilty not only of a delicate spiritual snap that could lead to, God forbid, unintentional murder, but of setting precedents and making deals with forces of evil and terror that espouse most premeditated and deliberate plans for destruction and murder. This Shabbat, when we conclude our double portion, and we conclude the book of Numbers, the congregation shall rise to its feet and in unison declare the traditional words that mark the end of each of the books of the Torah and the transition to the next. In Hebrew we declare Chazak, Chazak v'nitchazek, meaning be strong, and let us be strengthened. Indeed. Be strong, Israel, and let us be strengthened with careful and measured words, as we read about in the beginning of Parashat Matot, with love for the God of Israel and for each other, for his land and for the whole world, and, like the high priest who exemplifies personal responsibility, we pray that no mishap should befall anyone on our account, however unintentional. But as for those who would seek to destroy us, as we, at God's command, settle and occupy this land, and as for those who empower them, in the words of Isaiah the prophet, chapter 8 and verse 10, plan a conspiracy, and it shall be annulled. Speak your peace, and it shall not stand, for God is with us.